An ordinary night on patrol took a dark turn when Officer Daniel Reyes heard a chilling scream echoing from deep within the forest. What he discovered hidden in the shadows would uncover a nightmare no one saw coming. Stay with us, because the truth behind what he found will leave you speechless. If this story has you on the edge of your seat already, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss more jaw-dropping moments like this one. Your support helps us keep bringing these real-life mysteries to light. The early evening had settled into a quiet lull, a peaceful stillness that Officer Daniel Reyes had grown used to during his evening patrols around the rural outskirts of town. It was the kind of night he appreciated, calm, with the soft glow of streetlights flickering on as the day faded away. The rural roads were dark, save for the few houses scattered around and the thick, imposing line of trees that made up the edge of the forest just beyond the town's limits. It was a routine he had fallen into over the years. Driving slowly down the narrow roads, windows rolled down slightly to let in the fresh evening air. As an officer, you got used to the uneventfulness of places like this. There were no high-speed chases, no serious crimes. It was a quiet town, and the residents liked to keep it that way. Daniel had always preferred this to the chaos of city life. Here, he felt he could make a difference. Though, on nights like this, that difference often involved little more than breaking up a neighborly dispute or helping a stranded motorist. The soft sound of crickets filled the air as his headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. He was thinking about stopping by the diner for a quick cup of coffee, maybe catching up with a few colleagues on his way back to the station when he heard it. A scream. It was faint, distant, and barely audible over the hum of his patrol car and the chirping of insects, but it was unmistakable. Daniel froze, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he strained to listen. For a moment there was nothing but the usual night sounds. He wondered if he had imagined it, if it was just his mind playing tricks on him after so many uneventful nights. And then he heard it again. A child's scream. This time it was clearer, sharper, and it cut through the quiet night air like a knife. His heart raced. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was in trouble. Daniel quickly pulled his car to the side of the road, parking near the entrance to the forest that bordered the town. The scream had come from deep within the trees, far off the main road. His stomach tightened. He knew that the woods stretched for miles, and it was easy to get lost in them, especially after dark. He reached for his radio, his voice steady but urgent. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reyes. I'm on North Route 17 near the forest. I just heard a child scream. It sounded like it was coming from inside the woods. I'm going to investigate. Send backup immediately." "Copy that, Officer Reyes," the dispatcher replied, her voice calm but focused. "Backup is on the way. Stay safe." Daniel clipped the radio back onto his belt and grabbed his flashlight from the passenger seat. His training had taught him to always be prepared for the worst, but nothing could truly prepare you for the terror of hearing a child in distress. He stepped out of the car, the cool evening air wrapping around him as he moved toward the tree line. The forest loomed ahead of him, dark and dense, the shadows between the trees seeming to shift as the last of the daylight faded. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the woods, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and branches that crunched under his boots. The canopy above was thick, blocking out the last traces of sunlight, and soon all that remained was the beam of his flashlight and the sound of his breathing. The forest was eerily quiet now. The sound of the crickets had faded, replaced by a heavy silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Every step felt deliberate, every crack of a twig underfoot making his heart race just a little faster. He moved cautiously, scanning the area with his flashlight, listening for any sign of movement. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, he heard the faintest sound, the muffled sob of a child. It was faint but unmistakable, and it sent a chill down his spine. He quickened his pace, pushing deeper into the forest, weaving between the trees as the sound grew louder. His flashlight flickered briefly, but he tapped it back to life, his breath coming in short bursts now as the sense of urgency grew. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled upon a small, overgrown trail that led to a clearing, and there, just ahead, was an old weathered cabin. It was tucked away, hidden from the main road by the dense forest, and if you weren't looking for it, you would never have known it was there. The windows were dark, the wood was rotting, and the roof sagged as though it hadn't been maintained in years. But there was something else. A faint light flickered from within the cabin, barely visible through the cracks in the wooden walls. Daniel's pulse quickened as he crouched low, moving toward the cabin. The sobs grew louder, more desperate, and he could hear voices now. Low, gruff voices that seemed to be arguing. He crept toward one of the windows, his flashlight off to avoid detection. Peering through the grime-covered glass, his stomach twisted at what he saw inside. There, in the far corner of the room, huddled together on the floor, were 5 children. They couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, and they were bound. Ropes tied tightly around their wrists and ankles, their mouths gagged with dirty cloths. Their faces were streaked with tears, their eyes wide with fear as they watched the men who stood near them. 2 men, one was tall and lanky with greasy hair that hung in his face. He was pacing back and forth, agitated, his hands twitching nervously. The other was stockier, with a grizzled beard and a hardened expression. He had a gun holstered at his waist, and his arms were crossed as he leaned against the wall, watching the children with a cold, calculating look. Daniel's mind raced. Kidnapping. These children had been taken, and these men were holding them captive in this remote cabin. His heart pounded in his chest as he considered his options. He couldn't wait for backup. Those children were in immediate danger. But he couldn't take on 2 armed men by himself, either. He needed to be smart, careful. He backed away from the window, moving around to the side of the cabin where there was a narrow door. It was old and looked barely functional, but it was his best chance of getting inside without alerting the men. He turned the knob slowly, relieved to find it unlocked. The door creaked open and he slipped inside, his movements silent, his gun drawn. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit by a single lantern that sat on a table in the center of the room. The walls were lined with old furniture, dusty and broken, and the air smelled of mold and decay. He could hear the men talking more clearly now. "We need to get out of here soon," the lanky man muttered, his voice shaky. "We can't keep them here much longer." "Shut up," the stocky man growled. "We're not going anywhere until I say so. We've got a plan, remember?" The lanky man didn't respond, but Daniel could hear his footsteps pacing nervously. He was the weak link. If Daniel could catch him off guard, maybe he could gain the upper hand before the other man had a chance to react. He moved closer, his steps light, barely making a sound as he positioned himself behind the door that led into the main room. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and then stepped into the doorway, his gun raised. "Police! Don't move!" The lanky man froze, his eyes wide with shock. For a split second, everything was still. The children stared at Daniel, their expressions a mix of hope and fear, while the stocky man slowly uncrossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "You've made a big mistake, cop," the stocky man snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "Don't!" Daniel barked, his voice firm. "Hands where I can see them!" But the man didn't listen. His hand went for his gun, and Daniel fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the small cabin, and the stocky man fell to the ground, clutching his leg where the bullet had hit. The lanky man, his hands still raised, looked like he was about to bolt for the door, but Daniel was on him in an instant, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the wall. "Don't move," Daniel growled, pressing the man's face into the rough wooden surface. "I didn't want any part of this," the man stammered, his voice trembling. "It was all his idea. I swear I didn't hurt any of the kids." Daniel ignored him as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reyes. I've got 1 suspect down, the other in custody. We have 5 children here, all bound. Get paramedics here now." "Copy that, Officer Reyes. Backup is less than 5 minutes out." Relief washed over Daniel as he moved toward the children, holstering his gun and kneeling beside them. Their eyes were wide with fear, their small bodies trembling as they watched him. He gently untied the ropes around their wrists and removed the gags from their mouth. "I'm here to help you." The children clung to him, their tears turning to quiet sobs of relief as he freed them one by one. The little girl who had screamed was the last to be untied, and she threw her arms around Daniel's neck, her small body shaking with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel held her tightly for a moment before pulling back to look into her eyes. "It's okay. You're going to be okay." Just as he finished untying the last child, the sound of sirens filled the air, and moments later, the backup officers arrived, followed by paramedics. The cabin was soon filled with activity as the children were checked over and the suspects were taken into custody. As the medics led the children outside, Daniel stood by the door watching as they were loaded into ambulances. their faces pale but safe. One of the officers approached him, his expression a mix of respect and concern. "That was one hell of a call, Reyes. You did good." Daniel nodded, but he didn't say anything. His mind was still racing, still processing everything that had happened. He had saved those kids, brought them back from the brink of something terrible, but the weight of what he had seen, of the fear in their eyes, stayed with him. The night air felt cool against his skin as he stepped outside, away from the chaos of the cabin. The forest was quiet again, but it felt different now, darker, more menacing. The screams of that little girl would stay with him, echoing in his mind long after the night had ended. As the last ambulance pulled away, Daniel took a deep breath, his heart still racing, but his mind clear. He had done his job. He had saved those kids. But the forest, with its dark secrets and hidden dangers, would never be the same again.